He thought a two-line email could humiliate me in front of the whole company. He had no idea the woman he had just insulted had quietly owned more than half of the business for years. He sent the email on a Friday afternoon, right when the whole plant was beginning to slow down for the weekend. But the humiliation did not slow down with it. I had not even opened my inbox before someone from the assembly floor came toward me with the tense expression of a person who had just seen a wreck happen in real time. 19 years of my life had been compressed into 2 cold sentences, then copied to 16 other people as though I were just an item to be moved from one staffing chart to another. My name is Elaine Donovan. I was 54 years old that year, and I had spent nearly 2 decades at Hawthorne Ag and Equipment Corp. I had stood on the line, tightened bolts on combine headers, tested hydraulic systems, and learned to hear in the sound of a machine whether it was steady or hiding a failure that could take down an entire shift. I had not been lifted by family ties. No one rolled out a carpet for me. I did not enter the company carrying the name of the founding family. I climbed through long shifts, output numbers, and nights when my clothes smelled so strongly of hydraulic oil that I carried the metal scent home on my hands. Yet that afternoon, Blake Hawthorne, the nephew of the woman sitting at the top of the company, decided he could turn me from director of operations into a floor shift coordinator with one email. The message said my role was being restructured to reflect a commitment to forward-thinking leadership rather than legacy habits. I read that sentence in the parking lot beside my truck, with the October wind cutting across the asphalt and something heavy dropping inside my chest. I did not answer. I read it one more time, put my phone away, and drove home. Not because I had nothing to say, because I knew exactly when speaking would matter. My salary was being pulled down from $210,000 to $136,000, which meant more than a third of my income had vanished in a single click. The way he did it made me feel not only insulted, but handled like a piece of office furniture that could be pushed from one room to another. Blake was 27, held an MBA from Vanderbilt, had spent less than a year at a startup consulting firm in Nashville, and had returned to Hawthorne Ag with a title that sounded impressive, Chief Transformation Officer. That title had never been ratified by the board. Margaret Hawthorne, his aunt, had created it by executive memo and handed it to him like someone giving car keys to a child who had just learned to drive. 3 directors had objected. She overrode them. Blake had never stood beside a line when hydraulic pressure climbed wrong. He had never had to decide whether to stop production to prevent millions of dollars in equipment damage. He had never looked into the faces of workers who knew that if the line failed, their overtime money failed with it. I entered the company at 35. In my first 6 months, I learned every station in Bay 1. 2 years later, I became a floor supervisor. 6 years later, I became plant manager. 8 years before that email, I became director of operations. Every rung I climbed had fingerprints, sweat, and production results attached to it. Blake called all of that legacy habits. The phrase might have made me laugh if it had not been so ignorant. But what he did not know was that while I had spent those years quietly doing the work, I had also been doing something else. I was not only helping the company run, I was slowly buying the company itself. That part of the story began with Nathan Hartley. He did not carry the Hawthorne name, but he had built the company with Robert Hawthorne back in the late 1980s. By the time I arrived, Robert had been gone for several years, and Nathan was already in his 70s. But he still walked the floor every Thursday morning. He did not walk it for show. He stopped at each station, stood still long enough to see what people were actually doing, then asked one question. Only one, but always the right one. In my second year, he stopped at my station. I had just changed the assembly sequence on a hydraulic unit to reduce defects. I did not think someone at his level would notice. But Nathan stood there, watched, and asked why I had moved the pressure check earlier in the process. I explained. He did not praise me immediately. He reached into his jacket, took out a silver pen, handed it to me, and said paper without equity was just paper. My name was engraved on the side with a short line, own what you build. Elaine. I kept that pen like a quiet command. Nathan died 4 years later. But that sentence never left me. From the next quarter on, I began putting every bonus into the employee's stock purchase plan. Hawthorne Ag let employees buy shares at a discount if they reinvested their bonuses. Most people took cash, bought vehicles, fixed houses, or took their families on vacations. I never judged them. Everyone carries a different burden. But I chose stock. Quarter after quarter. Year after year. If you have ever had your work dismissed by someone who never paid the price to understand it, comment number 1. So, I know you understand that feeling. I was not buying out of greed. I was buying because, for the first time in my life, someone had told me my labor should leave a mark on ownership records. Not only on timesheets. After the employee stock plan came the quieter private purchases. Over the years, 4 senior executives retired while holding blocks of company shares they wanted to liquidate. The first was Martin Calloway, Vice President of Procurement, who wanted cash for a place in Montana. I bought his block at market value through my attorney. No pressure. No discount. No hidden angle. 3 years later, Victor Eldon, the quality director, was in a similar position. I bought his shares too. Then came Grant Whitmore, the outgoing chief financial officer. He wanted a clean break. No waiting on the board. No dealing with the Hawthorne family's shifting moods. I gave him that. The year before Blake sent the email, Colin Beaumont, a longtime plant manager, announced his retirement. Within 48 hours, I had an offer to him through the proper legal channel. Every transaction was documented. Every transfer was filed. Every ownership threshold was reported on schedule to the SEC under the Donovan Holdings Trust. 5%. Then 10%. Then 25%. Then majority control. All of it sat in the Edgar database, where anyone with responsibility could have found it if they had bothered to look. But that is the strange thing about power inside family companies. People born near it often assume they understand it, while people who work their way toward it are treated like old furniture. I did not hide by lying. I simply did not announce myself to people too arrogant to read public filings. Those are very different things. I knew I was walking a long, slow, legal road. Every time I signed another purchase document, I thought about Nathan's pen. The pen did not make me wealthy. It made sure I did not forget that ownership sometimes begins with one small decision, refusing to spend every reward for your exhaustion. The person who kept everything clean was Henry Bennett, my college friend from Purdue, and later a securities attorney. Henry was not the kind of lawyer who talked loudly to prove he was smart. He spoke slowly, wrote precisely, and always built at least 2 layers of protection into anything he drafted. He was the one who created the Donovan Holdings Trust for me in my second year at Hawthorne Ag, right after Nathan handed me the silver pen. Back then, I was only a young supervisor who had caught the attention of a founder, with nothing but bonuses, disciplina, and a stubborn belief that I did not want to spend my life standing near power without ever touching it. Henry tracked every share purchase, every threshold crossing, every form filed with the SEC. He once told me that documents were not meant to sit in drawers, they were meant to become walls. 17 years later, those papers became exactly that. The last time anyone at Hawthorne Ag reviewed the full ownership record was in 2020. And by then I had already passed 45%. Henry was also the person who showed me Article 7 of the corporate charter, a provision designed for the situation where a controlling shareholder's title, duties, or compensation were changed unilaterally by a corporate officer without written consent. We talked about it at the Route 51 diner, in an old corner booth, over 2 cups of black coffee. Henry called it my insurance policy and said he hoped I would never need to use it. Life does not care what we hope. And if this story is hitting something real for you, like this video, because many people need to hear that silence is not always weakness. Sometimes it is preparation. On the day Blake sent that email, I owned 51% of Hawthorne Ag and Equipment Corp. At the company's current valuation, my position was worth about $346 million. Just over half of a company valued at $680 million. I know that number sounds absurd for a woman who still made her own black coffee. still replaced her own back gate hinges, and still drove an old vehicle to work every day. But ownership does not have to look glamorous. It only has to be legal. Passion. And accumulated long enough. Blake, with a title the board had never ratified, had cut my salary by more than a third, demoted me, copied 16 people, and called nearly 2 decades of my work legacy habits. He had not only insulted me, he had accidentally triggered the exact provision Henry had warned me about. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for about 3 minutes and looked at the photograph of my husband, Graham, clipped to the sun visor. In the picture, he was laughing at our daughter Faith's middle school graduation, squinting into the sunlight. Graham had died 5 years earlier in a car accident on Route 51. Only a few miles from the diner where Henry and I used to meet. He had been a physical therapist at the county hospital, the kind of person who remembered every patient's name and every fear they carried. The week he died, I was at the plant for 72 straight hours managing a catastrophic hydraulic line failure in Bay 3. If the system had fully failed, the damage could have reached $11 million and cost us 3 months of production. I missed Graham's last 2 days. My son, Daniel, was 17 then. Faith was 12. I still do not have a clean answer for either of them. But I knew one thing after every loss. I held tighter to building something that could not be erased by an arrogant child with an email. I called Henry as soon as I left the parking lot. He answered on the first ring, as though he had been expecting the call for years. I read him the 2 sentences from the email, exactly as written. He stayed silent for a few seconds, not because he failed to understand, but because he was putting the legal consequences into their proper boxes. Then he asked about the private equity deal. Margaret Hawthorne was trying to sell a large block of shares to an outside fund. If that transaction closed, the ownership structure would shift, and my position could potentially be diluted below control. They had 72 hours before the closing deadline. When Henry mentioned it, I understood that Blake's email was not only personal stupidity, it sat next to a much larger power move. I did not know how much Margaret had told him, but I knew Blake was arrogant enough to think demoting me would clear the path for the next chapter. As he liked to call it, Henry told me he was already drafting the Article 7 filing. That evening, shortly after 6:30, he sent the final version. The filing stated emergency shareholder action on behalf of the Donovan Holdings Trust, beneficial owner of 51% of issued shares. Once activated, it triggered 2 things. At the same time, a mandatory board session within 36 hours and an automatic hold on any major equity transfer until the matter was resolved. That froze Margaret's private equity deal before her lawyers had time to search for a workaround. I did not sleep that night because I felt relieved. I slept because I was tired. Some battles begin with shouting. This one began with a humiliating email and would end, I knew, with the signatures of people who had never imagined me sitting at the head of the table. Henry's filing reached Corporate Secretary Sarah Miller's inbox on Friday evening. Sarah had held that job for nearly a decade, and she was the kind of person who read every line carefully, because she understood that one wrong comma could detonate an entire boardroom. She opened the document while eating a late dinner at her desk. Read the first paragraph. Then read it again. Then, she called Clark Redmond, the company's general counsel. Clark was at his son's soccer game and did not answer immediately. When he heard her voicemail on the way to his car, he called back at once. Sarah told him the Donovan Holdings Trust claimed 51% ownership, with Elaine Donovan as the beneficial owner. I can imagine the silence that followed. Clark had been general counsel at Hawthorne Ag for 8 years. But like many people in the company, he had assumed the Hawthorne family still held natural control because their name was on the door. That night, Clark went home, sat at his computer, opened the SEC database, and searched for the Donovan Holdings Trust. The filings loaded one by one. Transfers from Martin Calloway, Victor Eldon, Grant Whitmore, and Colin Beaumont. Quarterly purchases through the employee plan. Ownership thresholds reported on time. Nothing late. Nothing missing. Nothing blurred. 49 pages. Plus appendices. Clark printed all of it, He later told me his hands started shaking halfway through. Not because anything was wrong with the record, but because the record was too complete. If you want to hear more stories about people being underestimated while quietly claiming their rights, subscribe to the channel now. Clark did not need anyone to persuade him anymore. The documents spoke for themselves. And in corporate life, there is no colder voice than valid paperwork filed on time for 17 straight years. Clark called Margaret Hawthorne very late that night. She answered in the careful voice of someone who knows the company. Lawyer does not call at that hour to make small talk. Clark told her she needed to be at headquarters first thing in the morning because her nephew had signed something he had no authority to sign. Margaret did not understand right away. I know she could not have understood right away. Because in her mind, Blake was the succession project, the family bloodline, the fresh degree, the chance to cover an old company in a more modern vocabulary. But Clark did not speak in emotion. He spoke in filings. Elaine Donovan owned 51% of the company. It was all in the SEC records from her second year at Hawthorne Ag onward. Blake had demoted the controlling shareholder without board approval, without legal review, and without written consent from the majority owner. Then, Clark added the worst part: Blake's title had never been ratified by the board, which meant his authority to restructure anyone had been invalid from the start. Even without considering my ownership, Margaret stayed silent for a long time. I did not hear that call. But Henry later told me from the legal notes. She asked whether Blake knew. Clark said he did not. She told him not to tell Blake and said she would handle it. But Margaret did not handle anything, because while she sat in her bedroom, probably understanding for the first time that her affection for her nephew had become a risk worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Blake was on LinkedIn. He posted that sometimes transformation meant making the hard calls, that he had cleared the way for the next chapter, and that the future of Hawthorne Ag started now. He tagged the company account. He used the word legacy as an insult. By morning, a screenshot of that post was sitting in Henry's filing appendix. The next morning, I woke at 5:30, made black coffee, and let Rex out into the yard. Rex was a 9-year-old yellow lab who moved more slowly than he used to, but still looked at me with the calm expression of a creature who believed the world had not changed. From my back porch, I could see 2 grain silos on the horizon. They had stood there longer than my adult life. And on mornings like that, I sometimes wondered how many things in life only look solid until someone opens the right file. By nearly 7 o'clock, my phone was full of missed calls. Blake had called several times. Margaret's office had called. Clark had called. Sarah had called. A few numbers I did not recognize had called too. I returned no call except Henry's. He said the board was locked in. All 8 directors had confirmed the Thursday morning session. Clark had sent formal notice, with the Article 7 filing attached to every director. The 3 directors who had objected to Blake's title from the beginning called Clark before he even reached them. They were not only willing to vote with me, they had been waiting for a way out of this situation for months. As for the private equity deal, Margaret's lawyers had called Henry's office looking for a workaround. There was none. The hold was clean. The outside fund understood that the transaction had become trapped in a risk they could not explain to their investment committee. I stood by the kitchen window and watched Rex curl up near the back door. I did not feel triumphant. Triumph is the emotion of someone who wants to win quickly. I had been moving slowly for almost 20 years. What I felt was heavy and deep calm. I told Henry I would be there at 9:45. He said he would be there at 9:30 and wanted to be seated when they walked in. Then he added one more thing: wear your best suit. On the Wednesday before the meeting, I did exactly 3 things. First, I drove to the hardware store on Route 9 and bought a new hinge for the back gate that had been sticking since August. It had nothing to do with the board, ownership, charter provisions, or a private equity transaction. But it made me feel as though I still controlled the small things in my life. I went home and replaced the hinge in a little over half an hour. Rex sat in the grass and watched me as though I were performing surgery on a complicated machine. Then I drove to the Route 51 diner, the place with old vinyl booths and a waitress who had worked there longer than I had been at Hawthorne Ag. I ordered black coffee and a turkey sandwich, sat by the window, and ate slowly. There were a few people from the co-op across the road and a table of farmers from Macon County. No one knew who I was. No one knew that a few miles away, a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars was preparing to learn that the woman they had just humiliated was the controlling shareholder. My phone buzzed constantly. I turned it face down on the table. Blake called again. Margaret's office called again. Sarah called too. I did not answer. By mid-afternoon, Henry had given me the final update I needed. The filings were complete. The board was confirmed. The equity deal was frozen. And no obvious loophole existed. Everything else could wait. That evening, I went home, fed Rex, cooked a simple dinner, and sat in the kitchen looking at Graham's photograph on the refrigerator. It was from Daniel's 8th grade graduation. Graham was laughing with one hand on our son's shoulder, squinting into the afternoon sun. Daniel has his eyes. Faith has his way of going quiet when she has figured something out before everyone else. I thought about the fact that I had never told Graham my full ownership position. Not because I did not trust him. Maybe because I was afraid saying it aloud would make the dream easier to break. I went to bed at 9:45 and slept. That surprised me more than anything else. I had lost sleep over production reports, over lines that were running out of rhythm, over a sentence my daughter once asked when she was small about why I had not been there for the last 2 days of her father's life. But on the night before a meeting that could change the entire company, I slept deeply. Maybe that was because the most important work had already been done years earlier. On Thursday, October 17th, I woke at 5:30. I put on the charcoal suit Graham had once picked for me at a department store in Springfield. He had pulled it off the rack, held it up against me, and said it made me look like someone who did not need permission to enter any room. Since he died, I had worn it only twice. That day was the third time. I tied a navy blue tie in a simple knot and wore no jewelry except an old watch. Before leaving, I opened a drawer and took out Nathan's silver pen. I held it for a moment. The engraving had softened slightly with time, but I could still read it. Own what you build. Eline. I slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket. The drive to headquarters took less than half an hour. When I arrived, Roy Langley, the security guard at the front desk, stood faster than usual. He knew something was happening. The whole building knew something was happening. News inside companies never travels through organizational charts. It travels through eyes. Silence. And the way people suddenly stop talking when you pass. I greeted Roy the way I always did. He nodded and wished me luck. I did not know how much he knew, but I heard in his voice that he wanted me to win. That mattered more than I expected. The boardroom was on the top floor, behind thick glass doors, with a long wooden table that always made the person at the far end look farther away than they really were. Henry was already seated when I walked in, exactly as he had promised. In front of him sat a thick file marked with colored tabs, and beside it was a copy of the corporate charter. Clark Redmond stood near the screen, dark-eyed from lack of sleep, but fully alert. Sarah Miller sat against the wall with her laptop open, ready to take minutes. The directors arrived one by one. Some looked directly at me. Some avoided my eyes. Not necessarily because they opposed me, but because they were facing the fact that they had not known something they should have known. Margaret entered near the end. She wore a cream-colored suit, her hair neat, her face composed in the way only someone who has run a company for a long time can manage. Blake came in behind her with his MacBook, still wearing the confidence of someone who thought he had been called in to explain an administrative misunderstanding. He looked at me, then at my seat beside Henry, perhaps seeing for the first time that I did not look like an employee under discipline. When everyone was seated, Clark began. He did not open with pleasantries. He said the meeting had been convened under Article 7 of the Charter of Hawthorne Ag and Equipment Corp. Regarding unilateral action affecting the title, duties, and compensation of an employee holding a majority ownership stake. When the word majority landed in the room, Blake's eyes twitched. Margaret looked straight at Clark. I placed my hand on the folder in front of me and felt the small weight of Nathan's pen inside my jacket. In that moment, I understood that I had walked those halls for nearly 20 years as an employee. But in that room, the paperwork had finally caught up with the truth. Clark presented each point carefully, without unnecessary emotion and without losing force. The Donovan Holdings Trust was the beneficial owner of 51% of issued shares. The filings were public, timely, and continuous across 17 years. Purchases through the employee stock plan had been recorded quarterly. Transfers from Martin Calloway, Victor Eldon, Grant Whitmore, and Colin Beaumont all had contracts. Market value confirmations, effective dates, and reporting forms attached. There were no gaps, no shadow transactions, no path to calling it a misunderstanding. Blake moved his hand toward his MacBook, maybe hoping to find an argument he had never prepared. Margaret did not look at him. She said one word, "Don't." His hand stopped. Clark continued that, based on current valuation, my ownership position was worth about $346 million. More than half of a company valued at $680 million. Then he turned to Blake's title. Chief Transformation Officer had never been ratified by full board resolution. The position had been created by Margaret's executive memo. No vote had been taken. 3 directors had objected in writing and had been overruled. Therefore, at the moment Blake signed the email demoting me, he had no valid authority to restructure the compensation or duties of any employee. That legal point stood independently from my ownership. Blake looked at me. For the first time since I had known him, his face stopped performing. He said the filings could not be right. Henry answered that 17 years of documentation said otherwise, along with 49 pages of records and 11 pages of appendices, including Blake's late-night LinkedIn post, submitted as evidence of intent. I did not need to say anything. Every sentence that needed to be spoken was already on paper. When Clark called the vote, the room became so quiet I could hear the air system in the ceiling. The proposal had 3 parts reverse, all restructuring actions related to me. Remove Blake Hawthorne from the position of Chief Transformation Officer effective immediately, and appoint Elaine Donovan as CEO during a 30-day transition review. The 3 directors who had opposed Blake from the beginning voted first. Fast and clear. They did not need to examine another page. They had already seen enough months of proof that his appointment had been a mistake. The others followed one by one. Each yes landed like a locking pin sliding into place. When Clark reached Margaret, the room went completely still. She looked at Blake for a long time. It was not anger. I had seen anger in boardrooms before. It is sharp and hot. Margaret's look was older and heavier. To the look of someone staring at a person she loves while finally admitting that love has blinded her. She had built the company with Robert for more than 2 decades, then kept it standing after he died. She knew the company was not a toy for a nephew to use as his personal stage. Finally, she looked at me and said yes. 8-0. Unanimous. I did not take a deep victory breath. I did not smile. I did not give myself too large a moment. Part of me was thinking about the years I had spent on the floor. About the people working below us, who did not know that ownership had just shifted in a way they would hear only through rumor. I felt lighter. But I also felt sad. Not because of Blake. Because the company had been forced to go this far just to remember something very simple. The people who create value deserve respect, before the people who talk about the future are handed power. Blake stood slowly after the result was announced. He looked around the room as though waiting for someone to laugh and tell him the whole thing had been staged to teach him a lesson. No one laughed. No one stepped forward. No one saved him from his own signature. Then he looked at me, his face reddening with something between anger and panic. He said that on Friday I had just sat there and never even answered the email. I looked at him and said that was correct. I had not answered. He had wanted me to defend myself in front of the 16 people he had copied. He had wanted me to step into a fight where he thought he had chosen the field, the rules, and the audience. But I did not owe him an immediate reaction. I owed myself a lawful ending. Security came in right after that. Roy Langley was not part of the escort team. But I thought of him at the front desk and wondered how quickly the news would reach the lower floors. Blake gathered his laptop. But Clark instructed him to leave company equipment for review. He opened his mouth as if to object, then looked at Margaret. She said nothing. That was probably when he understood that every family connection in that room had been overtaken by legal documentation. Blake Hawthorne left the boardroom and left Hawthorne Ag and Equipment Corp. For the last time. The door closed. For a few seconds, no one spoke. I heard a chair move, papers being gathered, and Sarah typing the final line into the minutes. 2 hours later, I was formally CEO. There was no applause, no emotional speech. Clark walked me to his office to complete the transition documents. Sarah brought in 2 tabbed sets. Clark signed where he needed to sign. I signed where I needed to sign. It took less than an hour. Everything was so dry it almost felt funny. Considering how often a life can change direction through very ordinary signatures, before I left Clark's office, he looked across the desk and told me he had been general counsel for 8 years, but had never personally pulled the full ownership filings. He had assumed someone else had checked. No one had. He was not saying it to excuse himself. He said it like a man who needed to hear himself admit a professional failure. I told him I appreciated how he had run the session. That was true. Clark had kept it clean and fair when the situation could easily have turned chaotic. Within 45 days, the board approved a dividend distribution. My share came to $9.1 million. Within 60 days, Blake Hawthorne was named in a $22 million lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty and tortious interference with company interests. When you hold an unratified officer title and use it to take unilateral action against the controlling shareholder, while an equity transaction is pending that could dilute that shareholder's control, it is no longer a procedural mistake. It is a cause of action. Blake's LinkedIn post, the one he had used to congratulate himself near midnight, became Exhibit A. I did not feel happy reading the lawsuit file. Some people think victory means watching your opponent lose everything. I did not need that. I only needed the company set back on the proper foundation. I kept the corner office that had belonged to Margaret and then, briefly, to Blake. He had moved his things in within a week of receiving his memo-created title. I had his belongings boxed and sent to his apartment. The same afternoon, he left the boardroom. I placed Graham's photograph on the desk. The one from Faith's middle school graduation. He was laughing with one hand on our daughter's shoulder, squinting in the sunlight. I put Nathan's silver pen in the top drawer, where I could reach it without looking. Margaret resigned from the board 8 days after the vote. She submitted a letter that was only 1 paragraph long. I read it once and filed it. I did not need to read it again to search for regret. Some consequences are heavy enough on their own. Margaret had built the company with Robert for more than 2 decades, then kept it standing for years after he died. That deserved respect. I was not going to erase her contribution because the last chapter of her story had gone wrong, but she had allowed love for Blake to override judgment. She had let family blood replace governance. She had allowed a title with no legal foundation to sit in a chair that could threaten the entire company. The price she paid was not created by me. I simply did not prevent it from arriving. Daniel called me that Sunday the way he always did. I told him what had happened in a version that was true enough without being too heavy. He went quiet for a moment, then asked whether I really owned the company. I told him I would explain the whole thing at Thanksgiving. He laughed. The kind of laugh people use to cover something larger. Daniel was studying mechanical engineering at the University of Illinois. He understood machines, force, and the way a structure that appears still may be carrying enormous load inside. Faith texted me that night with 4 words. I knew it. Mom? I do not know exactly what she knew, but Faith is Graham's daughter, and she has his way of quietly fitting pieces together before adults realize what she has seen. Carol Reeves is still running Bay 1. Roy Langley is still at the security desk. The 2 grain silos are still visible from my back porch every morning. Some things do not change just because the nameplate on the door changes. The work is still the work. The floor is still the floor. The people are still the reason the building stands. The first thing I did as CEO was not change the slogan, launch a new transformation program, or hire consultants to rename the things people on the floor had understood for years. I went down to Bay 1. I stood beside the line and talked with Carol Reeves about shipping schedules, defect rates, pressure testing equipment, and the places where we were short on skilled hands. Some workers looked at me differently. I did not blame them. The day before, they thought I was the director of operations who had been demoted. The next day, they heard I was CEO and controlling shareholder. But I did not want them to lower their eyes more. I wanted them to tell the truth more. I told them the equipment had to ship right. The line had to run clean. And the people doing the real work would not be called obsolete legacy just because someone needed a good sentence for LinkedIn. Nathan understood that. Robert had understood it once. Margaret had understood it once too. Before fear of the company getting old turned into blind faith in a young man who spoke smoothly. Blake had never understood it at all. He thought the future was a presentation. I knew the future was a line that did not collapse when orders rose. A hydraulic unit that did not fail in a farmer's field. And a worker who went home feeling respected. I no longer need to look at the silver pen every day because I know the line by heart, but I still keep it in the top drawer. Not as a lucky charm. As evidence, some advice is so correct that it takes almost 20 years for its full power to appear. When someone calls you a legacy habit, they may only be admitting they do not have the patience to understand value built over time. If you have ever had someone half your age look at 2 decades of your work and call it dead weight, you know exactly where that Friday afternoon landed inside me. If you have ever been the person in the room who knows more than the people speaking the loudest, but still gets pushed aside because you do not have the right last name, the right school, the right look, or the right polished vocabulary, you know why I did not answer Blake's email? I was not silent because I was afraid. I was silent because the time to speak had not arrived. Friday was the day he thought he had lowered me. The following Thursday was the day the room had enough documentation to understand who actually had authority. 19 years taught me something no MBA program can package into a slide. Deck loyalty without ownership is only habit. Labor without protection is something other people can reprice whenever they want. And if you are building something worth keeping, find a way for your work to stand in documents, contracts, filings, and law. That does not mean everyone must buy the company they work for. Not everyone has that chance. But everyone can learn the rules around them better than the people who assume they were born to win. Record everything. Read what others ignore. Do not confuse noise with power. The quiet builder is often treated like the foundation, until the entire room realizes the foundation is what has been holding everything upright. Thank you to everyone who watched until the end of this video. If this story made you think about your own value, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and remember that sometimes the biggest win does not come from speaking first, but from preparing longer than every person who underestimated you